Hello and welcome to Atop the Fourth Wall, where bad comics burn. And welcome to the final episode of Event Comics Month 2, Crisis of the Wars. Oh, geez, this one's gonna be rough. So, Final Crisis. Yeah, people have been anticipating this one for a while. Mostly me, since I thought I was gonna be reviewing this in like 20 years or so. Yeah, back in 2009, a residual effect of Dr. Insano playing around with hypertime sent me about 30 years into the future. My future self was reviewing it at that time, and, well, I kind of expected that would be when I eventually covered it.
Your future is whatever you make it, so make it a good one.
Well, I failed that already, because if I was trying to make it a good future, I wouldn't be talking about this thing. On the plus side, pretty sure I'm not going to be living with my parents in the future. Unless YouTube collapses and I lose yet another platform. Anyway, Final Crisis. Back in 2009, I did a 4-part look at Countdown, a weekly series made in the wake of the much more successful book 52. It was a mess, and very bad. Recall that I'm pretty sure I can find a way to link every bad comic ever made, at least from the big two, back to Countdown in some way. Yes, even books that had been made before it, it's a crap factor that transcends space and time. Like I said, I read Countdown as it was coming out, hoping beyond hope that it would either improve, or that the journey would be worth it in getting to Final Crisis. Well, here we are at Final Crisis, and frankly, yeah, the journey was really not worth it. Final Crisis is considered incomprehensible at best by many, but others herald it basically as a work of art, with a very popular theory about the book that it's a metatextual deconstruction on the nature of storytelling, superhero comics, and in particular that it's a parallel to an Alan Moore Superman story, namely, Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow. That one's about the last adventure of the Silver Age Superman before his existence was retconned by Crisis on Infinite Earths. I'll get to my feelings about that theory in the review, but I am including a link in the video description to that analysis just because it's really good and well thought out. But let's go back to Countdown for a second in relation to this event. Grant Morrison handed DC Editorial a bunch of plot points for Final Crisis, which had its first issue actually written a year before Countdown, and the higher-ups were like, cool, let's have a story where we get to that point. The problem is that Grant Morrison apparently has a completely different DC universe going on inside his head than what's actually happening in it. So while his story is technically better, it's at odds with what happened in Countdown. Grant had actually asked DC Editorial explicitly to not use the new gods in anything for the year leading up to Final Crisis. He wanted their return in the story to be more impactful because no one had seen them for a while. So naturally, DC Editorial took that request and said, hey, let's have them show up everywhere to the point where people are sick of seeing them, and then kill them twice before they show up in the book where they're supposed to die. Editorial mandates, guaranteed to crush any story that could potentially be good, or your money back. Just kidding, you're not getting your money back. It's made worse by the fact that since we can't see what's going on in Grant Morrison's version of events, a lot of the story feels confusing and nonsensical. Grant said at the time that fans cared more about the continuity disconnect than about what was actually in the story. Yeah, well, that kind of happens when you're cheated out of over $150 for something that's supposed to be leading into your event, but turns out it was just some garbage. And considering how Morrison mines a bunch of obscure continuity for Final Crisis, him rolling his eyes at fans being concerned with continuity is a bit hypocritical. Others have said that the problem with Final Crisis is that it's actually the culmination of several of Grant Morrison's other stories, most especially the maxi-series Seven Soldiers. Long story short there, it featured 7 different mini-series of heroes all fighting a war that was interconnected, even though the 7 characters didn't realize that. One of those stories was Mr. Miracle, where Scott Free's apprentice Shiloh Norman took on the role and fought a reborn Darkseid in a strange environment where the new gods were all humans. That's probably the strongest connection, but even that seems tenuous here connected with everything else, since it's not really necessary to read that to get Final Crisis. Others say that Final Crisis is so convoluted and confusing because of stuff that was left out of the main book but should have been put in. The end result, though, as I said, is that Final Crisis is considered by most people to be weird, confusing, and impossible to untangle what the hell is going on. But here's the funny thing. Upon rereading it for this review, it's actually mostly straightforward what's going on. Mostly. The dialogue is awkward, I'll definitely say, but there is dialogue within the comic that says what is happening. Unfortunately, it's very much a case of tell, don't show, not helped by a bunch of things happening at once, and expects you to remember a lot of things said that don't seem like they're important because they're not framed as important. I also say mostly because, well, I'll explain when we get to it, but needless to say, there's a reason why people say there's stuff missing from the comic. I do think there is one other problem with the story. It was hyped completely wrong. I think what happened here is that since Infinite Crisis had years of successful build-up, multiple miniseries that led into it, and established important plot points for the crossover, that DC hoped to replicate that success for Final Crisis. Problem is that those prologues and lead-in stories are completely contradicted by the actual events of Final Crisis, or had nothing at all to do with it. Countdown was the main factor there, and we all saw what a great disaster that was. A few of the tie-in miniseries were mostly unrelated, like Legion of Three Worlds, or there was Rage of the Red Lanterns, which introduced the Red Lanterns properly into the Green Lantern mythos, and had even less to do with Final Crisis than Legion of Three Worlds. I mean, at least Superman meeting with the Legion in the future is something that happens in Final Crisis, but we can get into all that later. In the meantime, let's dig into Final Crisis and try to unpack this sucker.
Welcome to Atop the Fourth Wall, where bad comics burn. Linkara's gonna teach you all a lesson you won't learn. Brodsky, you're not the smartest. Life out, you're not an artist. Anyone who's had a bad comic published, it could be your turn. Linkara, he's a man punch, wears a pretty hat. Linkara, he has a magic gun. Where'd he purchase that? Linkara, coins, robots, Amazon and trucks. Linkara, this comic sucks. Linkara.
I'm going into the covers this time, but only in a broad sense because I hate these things. I really do. One of the things that DC did to hype up Final Crisis was to say that it was the final part of the Crisis trilogy of Crisis on Infinite Earths, Infinite Crisis, and then this. But you look at the covers to those books. While some are just focused on a single moment of importance, just as many covers feature dozens of characters engaged in activity. Things meant to showcase just how huge an event it is, how it affects so much in their universe. And yet here we are with Final Crisis, and 2/3 of the covers are taken up by nothing! Here, have this narrow strip of stuff in the center, usually just a single person. It really did feel like they were trying to ape novels at the time with how they were portrayed. Big hardcover books with maybe a single image, but otherwise the title was what was important. The text and color of those side bits are supposed to deteriorate as the issues went on, but that just made it look like a printing error. We open with a caveman. Oh god, it's Marvel! This is a crisis! No, this is Anthro, DC's caveman character. We actually saw him briefly in one of the interludes of the original Crisis. Only here, he's met by Metron of the New Gods, who needs a posture pal because, man, is he slouching. It's also a bit of a revised look for him, all white with the blue lines on his face and body instead of the black and blue bodysuit. I dig it. Have no fear. Here is knowledge. Never fight a land war in Asia. And so Metron departs, with Anthro walking away with fire. Ha! Take that, Monolith. Anthro uses the fire to repel other caveman invaders, including the immortal Vandal Savage. And it's here, with a burning forest fire, that we get some narration from the present. You ask me, fire was our first big mistake. The second was thinking that gasoline would put it out. Like everything else the sad, stinking human race ever thought of, we take a good idea and we use it to kill ourselves. Thank God I've got these cigarettes handy to put out the fire. This is Detective Dan Turpin, a longtime supporting character for Superman, but he got his first appearance in the New Gods books. He played a larger part in the Superman animated series, where his look was based more on his creator, Jack Kirby. Here, he narrates about how he's on the trail of a bunch of missing kids, but has instead found the body of Orion crashed into a crate. He's still alive, but not for very long. He spots Turpin and grabs him, rambling about how, "They did not die!" and "He is in you all!" before finally collapsing and dying. And as the skies begin turning red, the Black Racer appears overhead. Basically think of him as the Grim Reaper of the new gods. Except instead of carrying around a scythe, he rides around on skis. But yeah, red skies, one of the few indicators of the crisis happening. Though this time it's accompanied by rain and lightning. It does look cool. As the John Stewart Green Lantern arrives to take over the investigation of Orion's death, Turpin meets with former police detective Renee Montoya, who took over as the Question in the series 52. The artwork for most of the series is done by J.G. Jones, who is usually very good, and indeed his work in the book is nicely moody and detailed, but for some reason he screwed up on drawing the Question in this panel. We can see details on her face, which shouldn't be the case considering the Question's whole motif is a completely blank face. In any event, he asks what happened to the guy who used to be the Question. Lung cancer. From smoking. I look forward to meeting the woman who turns into the new Dan Turpin. Turpin remarks that he was a lightweight, which he immediately apologizes for, though the artwork doesn't make it clear why he said so other than maybe he just realized it's not good to speak ill of the dead to the person who succeeded them. Still, she gives him some more info about the missing children, that they were all metahumans. Seems like that would be something brought up right away, you know, them all having superpowers, but whatever. All her evidence keeps pointing back to a location. The Dark Side Club. Many were disappointed that it was not a Star Wars-themed bar. Hal Jordan arrives at the crime scene late, saying he was having a bunch of sleepless dreams. Since the Green Lanterns are basically intergalactic cops, they have a code system for crimes. In this case, a 1011. Deicide. I'd say that's an unlikely thing to happen, but the DC Universe long ago established that basically every single religion's deities exist and are real, so probably not that unlikely. They get into huge fistfights over who started the universe. I'm not kidding. There's been more than one war between deities in the DCU. They report this to the Guardians of the Universe, who set up an isolation field around the planet's Lagrange point to keep anyone else from coming in, and dispatch an Alpha Lantern to lead the investigation. The Alpha Lanterns were established in Jeff Johns' Green Lantern books, basically an internal affairs division where Lantern members were converted into cyborgs fused with their power batteries and rings. It was not pretty, and they did not end well. Here's one of those bits of awkward dialogue I mentioned before. Hal, these new gods. They come with bad gods, too. Yeah, John, I'm pretty sure Hal is aware of them. Why did you even need to say that? A group of teen heroes, consisting of Empress, Sparks, and former Teen Titans animated series-only characters Mossy Manos, are in a junkyard looking for what appears to be Metron's Mobius chair. Empress claims she saw it in her visions, though my research indicates that she didn't have visions as part of her powers. Young Justice fans, feel free to correct me there. But yeah, apparently the four are trying to launch their own Teen Titans subdivision, but are then attacked by Dr. Light and Mirror Master. Dr. Light, despite still being as unnecessarily lecherous as he's been since Identity Crisis, makes this goofy remark. The first innocent victims of the blindingly obvious Dr. Light Mirror Master team! Grant Morrison is obsessed with the bizarre minutiae and history of the DC Universe, so it wouldn't surprise me if he deliberately wrote that line to make Dr. Light still be as dumb as he was in the 80s while trying to keep the retcons done to him. And it just feels really uncomfortable and weird. Despite the attack and the captured metahuman kids, the four are not what they're after, but Metron's chair. They say they're working for a villain named Libra. And over to the Secret Society of Supervillains, still in operation after the events of Infinite Crisis, just without Alexander Luthor leading them. Going with what I just said about DC minutia, Libra was a Justice League villain from the 70s who only appeared in one story, stealing the powers of the League and ascending into godhood or something like that. He's arguing with several members of the Society, like Lex Luthor and Vandal Savage, that he should be given control of the Society. His reasoning is religious. Strikes me your enemies fight and win again and again because they truly believe their actions are in accordance with a higher moral order. But what happens in a world where good has lost its perpetual struggle against evil? It probably means that drinks are on good then. But of course he needs an actual sales pitch to take control. In this case, he promises all of the Society members will get their heart's desire. To prove this, he's brought another obscure villain with him, the Human Flame. He fought the Martian Manhunter once, in a 1959 comic. What's his deal? He has a suit with a bunch of nipples on the front that shoot fire. Yeah, you can see why it took 50 years for the guy to appear again. But that's kind of the point. The Human Flame's greatest desire is to see the Martian Manhunter killed. A big task, and Libra does it, having some villains drag in the Martian Manhunter and killing him. If he'll do something that big for someone so small, then he's a force to be reckoned with. Meanwhile, Dan Turpin meets with the Tattooed Man, a villain who uses mystical tattoos on his body to fight, usually by summoning creatures from them. He's agreed to take Turpin to the Dark Side Club. Turpin just thinks it's an S&M joint, but upon entering, he's quickly met by the owner, Boss Darkside. Turpin mentions that he expected him to be someone younger. Bodies. They wear out hard in here. And me, I was hurt in a fall, you might say. Oh, and I tell you, man, I could just sleep for 1,000 years. Boss Darkside immediately admits that he kidnapped the children. There was a war in heaven, Mr. Turpin, and I won. Your future belongs to Darkside now. Wait, you won the war, and yet you're operating out of this crap hole? Man, heaven must have really gone downhill. He reveals the children, who all have glowing red eyes, and says that he's exposed them to the anti-life equation. Meanwhile, at the Hall of Justice, now there's a phrase I don't actually say that often, the Justice League are meeting to discuss Orion's murder, and once again the dialogue gets a bit weird. There's nothing particularly wrong with it, it's just it feels overly formal and uses descriptors that are not often associated with these characters. For instance, Wonder Woman says this: "If the evil gods are anywhere on Earth, it's imperative that we find them before they strike." Why call them that specifically instead of just Darkseid's forces or the like? Then there's Superman's line. "Unfortunately, Orion's murder seems to confirm some of our fears. Incidences of contact with the gods of New Genesis and Apocalypse have been on the increase. And I certainly wasn't involved in any miniseries where the new gods died. Nope, this totally confirms our fears about the new gods dying." And again, describing them specifically as gods. Superman also says that they're celestials, referring to them as being of divine origin or the like. And this is kind of important given what the actual Crisis ends up being. Final Crisis seems to interpret the new gods as literal gods, that doing things to beings of ultimate power and godliness has the ability to warp reality itself. Then you add on the beginning with Metron handing fire to early man, like Prometheus or something, describing it as knowledge like in the Garden of Eden, Orion's murder described by the Green Lanterns as deicide, and that just adds more layers to the argument. Problem is, the new gods are not literal gods. No, they really are not. Metron is some dude flying around in a high-tech chair, Orion is a guy who can punch really hard and has a shiny helmet, and Darkseid is some asshole who can shoot lasers out of his eyes while trying to find the comfiest couch in the world to sit on. I don't say these things to diminish them as characters, their importance in the DC universe, or anything like that. I'm just reminding you that they are not tied into the very fabric of existence. They're aliens with super advanced technology and a few fancy powers if they're lucky. They are not gods any more than any other superhero in the DC universe is a god. Given how Kirby came up with the idea, if you really wanted to go with them being actual gods, it's more like the Norse pantheon. Sure, they're extraordinarily powerful, but not in the way they seem to be portrayed in Final Crisis. In an interview, Grant seems to contradict that. He describes the gods of mythology more along the lines of ultimate expressions of human emotion, and that the new gods are similar in regard to that, with Darkseid as the ultimate expression of evil, which doesn't quite work when you remember that these ultimate expressions of mood and feelings and stuff can be punched. Also, one other thing bugs me about this sequence. Orion was a member of the Justice League and friends with these people. Is anyone even slightly upset about him being dead? They do care about the Martian Manhunter, we see his funeral in the second issue, but Orion's death is just, yeah, this is probably bad, let's keep an eye on things. But now it's time for the return of everybody's favorite indecisive part of Countdown, the monitors. Yep, they're here, and we see from their perspective, the multiverse is an orrery with a bunch of Earths just kind of stacked on top of the main DC Earth, referred to as New Earth. Because what's the silliest way we can show parallel universes? Oh, I know! Let's put them in a big glass display case and stacked on top of each other like marbles glued together. They mention the destruction of Earth 51 from Countdown and its monitor, now identified as Nix Wotan, who's put on trial for negligence in its destruction. I don't know how this played out in Grant Morrison's head, but whatever. They sentence him to exile, being reborn as a human on New Earth and stripped of his memories and abilities. A female monitor named Ouija Dell cries out that it's not his fault. "Silence! We are multiversal monitors, ancient and wise. We should do something! Should we do something? We should do something! Should we do something? That line is so stupid anyway. Shut up, we're old and smart, dagnabbit. So yeah, looks like that whole who monitors the monitors bullcrap at the end of Countdown didn't really work out. Good job, guys. Ouija Del runs off, but is met by another female monitor, Zillow Vala, who tries to comfort her. I think, when Ouija Del wonders why she cares so much. Ouija Del, behold, we are monitors, who were faceless once. We all now have names and stories. There are heroes and villains, secrets and lovers. And I'm just saying, we could do that whole lovers thing if you're into trying new stuff. She says that another monitor, Ogama, fears that contact with beings in the multiverse has resulted in their changes. Consider our divine engine, our celestial fountain of interlocking universes. All existence depends on its survival. Okay, 1, what are those things? 2, why does all existence depend on them? They're different universes separated by vibrational frequencies. What the hell does your damn bird fountain have to do with that? See, that is definitely one of the problems in this book. Exposition is given, but it's vague and poetic instead of actually descriptive. There was a war in heaven! These celestial beings can crack the planet in half! Our divine engine, blah blah blah! Tell us what the hell any of these things is! Hell, it'd be fine if it was just vague to start with and then explained in more detail in later issues, but it doesn't! And for anyone who never read Countdown, and let's be fair here, there are plenty of reasons why people would not have read Countdown, how about you explain why there are 52 monitors now instead of the 1 from Crisis on Infinite Earths? Especially when the origin for that monitor is completely at odds with whoever the hell these guys are. Another monitor, who I think is supposed to be that Ogama guy, friggin' turns to the camera and holds his hand up to whisper to the audience like he was making a friggin' Shakespearean soliloquy. Attentions wander. Wotan, my only obstacle is gone. We're on. What do you, the people at home, think? I think what's supposed to be happening there is he's just speaking into a wrist communicator, but why is he doing that so close to the two? Back at the time of Anthro, he's drawing some sort of symbol in the ground when he suddenly finds himself transported to the far future, where the last boy on Earth, Kamandi, runs up to him and tells Anthro that Metron gave him a weapon against the gods and they need it now. Anthro then is teleported back to the past and issue 1 ends with Nyx Wotan waking up on New Earth. Naturally, Kamandi's presence in the story is vital. You see, the story starts with Anthro, the first boy on Earth, and ends with Kamandi, the last boy on Earth. There is no other significance. Grant Morrison just thought it was important.